The gunshot echoed across the rolling prairie, startling a flock of birds into flight as Rose Blackwood's trembling hands gripped the wooden cradle. Tears streamed down her dirt-streaked face as she rocked back and forth on the porch of her isolated homestead, the rhythm matching the erratic beating of her broken heart. The cradle, lovingly crafted by her late husband, held nothing but a small blanket where their baby should have been. Montana Territory, 1876. The endless sky stretched above her like a mockery of freedom, the golden sunset painting the horizon in colors too beautiful for such a dark day. Rose had lost everything in the span of a week: her husband to a mining accident, and her newborn daughter to a fever that swept through with the merciless efficiency of a prairie fire. Now, all that remained was the empty cradle and the endless rocking. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her homestead. Rose made no move to reach for the rifle propped against the wall. What was the point? What more could be taken from her? The rider approached slowly, his silhouette growing larger against the setting sun. A tall man atop a dappled gray horse, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "Madam?" His voice was deep, gravelly from trail dust. "You all right out here?" Rose didn't answer, didn't look up, just kept rocking the empty cradle. Xavier Holt dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. He'd been riding for 2 days straight, tracking a gang of outlaws who'd robbed a stagecoach near Fort Benton. As a bounty hunter who'd earned his reputation through determination rather than cruelty, he was known for bringing in criminals alive when possible. But the trail had gone cold, and this isolated homestead was the first sign of humanity he'd seen in miles. The woman on the porch didn't acknowledge him, her gaze fixed on the empty cradle she rocked with mechanical precision. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and even from a distance, he could see the hollow look in her eyes, a look he recognized all too well. "Madam," he tried again, approaching slowly, "do you need assistance?" His eyes scanned the property, noting the freshly turned earth behind the house: 2 graves, one small, one larger. When she still didn't respond, Xavier climbed the 3 creaky steps to the porch and, after a moment's hesitation, sat down on the bench beside her. Without a word, he placed his hand on the other side of the cradle and began to rock with her. They sat there in silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and stars began to prick the darkening sky. Finally, Rose spoke, her voice barely audible. "They're gone." 2 simple words that carried the weight of her entire world. Xavier nodded, still rocking. "I know. My husband Thomas, mining accident, then the fever took my Sarah." Her voice cracked. 8 days old. Xavier removed his hat and placed it on his knee, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "I'm Xavier Holt. I was tracking some men, but I've lost their trail." He paused. "I'm sorry about your family, madam." Rose Blackwood. She finally looked at him, really seeing him for the first time. His face was weathered from years under the sun, but his eyes were kind. "Why are you sitting here rocking with me, Mr. Holt?" Xavier's gaze dropped to the empty cradle. "Because nobody should have to rock alone." Something in his voice told Rose he understood loss intimately. She didn't ask for details, some wounds were too personal to probe. They continued rocking in silence until the chill of the night air made Rose shiver. "You should go inside, Mrs. Blackwood. It's getting cold." "There's nothing inside but empty rooms and memories," Rose whispered. Xavier stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight. "Then I'll build a fire out here. You need warmth and food. When's the last time you ate?" Rose couldn't remember. Days had blurred together since the funerals. She watched as Xavier efficiently gathered wood from the pile near the house and built a small fire in the pit a few yards from the porch. From his saddlebags, he produced some jerky and coffee. "It's not much," he said, handing her a tin cup of the strong, black coffee, "but it's hot." The warmth of the cup in her hands seemed to thaw something inside Rose. "Thank you," she said, taking a small sip. It was bitter but comforting. "Tomorrow," Xavier said carefully, I can help you with whatever needs doing around here before I continue on. Rose wanted to tell him there was no point, that she was considering abandoning the homestead, but instead she found herself nodding. I'd be grateful. They fell into silence again, the crackling of the fire and the gentle creaking of the cradle the only sounds in the vast stillness of the prairie night. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity that only comes in the high country. Rose had finally fallen asleep on the porch swing. A blanket Xavier had found inside draped over her. He had slept on the ground near the fire, one hand always near his revolver old habits from years on the trail. Xavier was already up, feeding his horse and Rose's neglected mare when she stirred. For a moment, in the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, Rose forgot her grief. Then reality crashed back and she sat up with a start, eyes automatically searching for the cradle. "Good morning," Xavier said, approaching with a cup of fresh coffee. "Hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of starting breakfast, found some flour and dried apples in your pantry." Rose took the coffee with murmured thanks, surprised by the normality of the moment. "You didn't have to do that. Been taking care of myself on the trail for 15 years. Making breakfast isn't any trouble." He paused, studying her face in the morning light. The grief was still there, but something else too, a flicker of awareness, perhaps even determination. After a simple breakfast of pan biscuits and stewed dried apples, Xavier surveyed the homestead. "What needs doing most urgently, Mrs. Blackwood?" Rose looked around, truly seeing the state of her home for the first time in days. The garden was wilting, the chicken coop needed mending, and the roof had a leak she'd noticed before everything happened. "The garden, I suppose. Winter will be here before long." Her voice sounded stronger than yesterday, though still hollow. They worked side by side through the morning, weeding and salvaging what they could of the vegetables. Xavier moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to hard work, while Rose found that the physical labor provided a temporary respite from her thoughts. "You have a good piece of land here," Xavier commented as they paused for water. "Good soil, decent protection from the winds." "Thomas chose it, said it reminded him of where he grew up in Pennsylvania." Rose touched a tomato plant gently. "He had such plans for this place." Xavier nodded, understanding the weight of dreams cut short. Plans can change, but land endures. This place could still be everything he hoped for. Rose gave him a sharp look. "Not without him, not without our daughter." "No," Xavier agreed quietly. "Not the same, but something different perhaps, something that honors them." They finished the garden in silence, then moved on to the chicken coop. As Xavier mended the wire, Rose gathered eggs, surprised to find half a dozen. Life continued, stubbornly persistent, even when it seemed impossible. By late afternoon, they had accomplished more than Rose had thought possible. The most pressing repairs were done, the animals fed, and even the cabin had been tidied. Rose had changed into a clean dress, and though her eyes still held profound sadness, her movements were more purposeful. As the sun began its descent, Xavier reluctantly mentioned his departure. "I should get back on the trail tomorrow. Those men I'm tracking have a 3-day head start now." Rose nodded, unsurprised but feeling a strange reluctance to see him go. This stranger had anchored her to the world when she'd been drifting in grief. "Of course. You've been more than kind, Mr. Holt." "Xavier," he corrected gently. "And it was no hardship, Mrs. Blackwood." "Rose," she responded automatically, then added, "These men you're tracking, they're dangerous." Xavier's expression hardened slightly. "They robbed a stagecoach near Fort Benton, shot the driver and a passenger." The passenger was a young mother traveling to meet her husband. Her child watched it happen. Rose's hand flew to her mouth. "That poor child." "Yes," Xavier's jaw tightened. "That's why I need to find them. Justice needs serving, and that child deserves to know the men who took his mother will answer for it." Rose studied him with new understanding. This wasn't just a job to him, it was a mission driven by something personal. "You'll be careful," a ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Always am." That evening they again sat on the porch, the empty cradle between them. Neither rocked it now, but its presence was a silent acknowledgement of what had brought them together. "Tell me about your husband," Xavier said suddenly. Rose looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Thomas was dedicated to the land, to our future. He worked at the silver mine to save money for better equipment, but his heart was here." She gestured to the homestead. "He could look at an empty field and see crops already growing. He built this cabin with his own hands and this cradle." Her voice faltered. Xavier nodded encouragingly. "He sounds like a good man." He was. Rose took a deep breath. "What about you? Do you have family somewhere?" Xavier gazed out at the darkening landscape. "Had a wife and son once in Colorado. Influenza took them 12 years ago." "I'm sorry," Rose said softly, understanding now why he had sat down to rock with her yesterday. "Is that why you became a bounty hunter?" "Partly. Needed something to do, somewhere to go. Turned out I was good at tracking and I believe in justice." He shrugged slightly. "It's a living. A lonely one, I'd imagine." "Most of the time," he agreed. "But then, loneliness can find you anywhere." Rose felt the truth of his words acutely. She would be alone again tomorrow when he left, alone with her grief and memories in this place that had once held so much promise. "I don't know if I can stay here," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Everything reminds me of what I've lost." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "After Caroline and James died, I couldn't bear our home, left everything but what would fit in my saddlebags." His eyes met hers. "Running doesn't help, Rose. The memories come with you." "Then what does help?" she asked, desperate for any wisdom he might offer. "Time, purpose." He hesitated. "And eventually, allowing new memories to form alongside the old ones." They fell silent, contemplating his words as the stars emerged above them, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Morning came too quickly. Xavier saddled his horse as Rose prepared a small package of food for his journey. Bread she had baked at dawn, some dried meat and apples. "Which way will you go?" she asked, handing him the bundle. "North, toward the Canadian border. That's their most likely route if they're smart." He secured the package to his saddle. "I should reach the next town by nightfall. I'll send word to the sheriff there to check on you when he can." Rose wanted to tell him it wasn't necessary, that she would be fine, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Xavier, for everything." He mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Looking down at her, something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps, or a moment of indecision. "Rose," he said finally, "I meant what I said about this land. It's good land worth fighting for." "I'll remember," she promised, though she wasn't sure if she would stay or go. With a nod and a touch to the brim of his hat, Xavier turned his horse and rode away. Rose watched until he was nothing more than a speck on the horizon, then turned back to the empty homestead, the empty cradle, and wondered what came next. 3 days passed, each slightly easier than the last. Rose established a routine, caring for the animals, tending the garden, making small repairs she was capable of handling alone. She still cried, still ached with loss, but the paralyzing grief began to loosen its grip, allowing her to function. On the 4th day, riders approached 3 men, dusty and rough-looking. Rose was in the garden when she spotted them and quickly retreated to the cabin, grabbing Thomas's rifle from above the door. "Hello, the house," one of the men called as they neared. "Just looking for water and maybe a meal we can pay for." Rose stood in the doorway, rifle not quite aimed at them but ready. "The well's around back. You're welcome to water your horses." The men dismounted, and Rose studied them warily. 2 were younger, probably in their 20s, with the hard eyes of men who'd seen too much too soon. The 3rd was older, with a scar running from his left eye down to his jaw. "Obliged, madam," the scarred man said with a tip of his hat. "Been riding hard. Name's Weaver." "These are my associates, Burke and Dawson." "Mrs. Blackwood," Rose replied cautiously. "There's a pump by the trough." As the men watered their horses, Rose noticed Burke examining the property with too much interest, his gaze lingering on the cabin and the small barn. Weaver approached the porch, keeping a respectful distance. "You alone out here, Mrs. Blackwood?" The question raised her hackles. "My husband will be back soon," she lied smoothly. "He's just checking the far pasture." Weaver's eyes narrowed slightly, and Rose knew he didn't believe her. Her grip tightened on the rifle. "Well, we won't impose," Weaver said finally, "but we'd be grateful for any food you could spare. We can pay." He pulled out a coin purse that looked too fine for a man of his apparent means. Rose hesitated. These men made her uneasy, but refusing them outright might provoke them. "I have some bread and stew from yesterday. You can eat out here on the porch." She retreated inside, keeping the door open to watch them as she reheated the stew. When she brought it out, the men thanked her with exaggerated politeness that did nothing to ease her concern. As they ate, Dawson, the youngest of the three, asked casually, "You get many visitors out here, madam?" "Occasionally," Rose answered noncommittally. "The sheriff stops by when he's in the area." "That's so." Weaver exchanged glances with Burke. "When was he by last?" "Just a few days ago," Rose lied again. "Along with a bounty hunter tracking some criminals." At the mention of a bounty hunter, all three men tensed visibly. Burke's hand moved subtly toward his holster. "This bounty hunter," Weaver said carefully. "Tall fellow, dark hair with some gray." Rose's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "I couldn't say, I didn't speak with him." Weaver studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Well, we appreciate the meal, Mrs. Blackwood. We should be moving on." They finished eating quickly, and Rose took their plates with relief. Weaver placed several coins on the porch rail, far too much for a simple meal. "For your trouble," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As they mounted up, Burke lingered, looking back at the cabin with undisguised interest. "Nice place you got, Mrs. Blackwood. Shame you're so isolated out here. Anything could happen." "Burke," Weaver snapped, "mount up." With a final nod to Rose, they rode away. She watched them go, the rifle still in her hands, a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Those were the men Xavier was tracking, she was certain of it. And now they knew someone was after them. Worse, they might suspect she had lied about Xavier's visit. Rose spent a restless night, barricading the door and keeping the rifle close. By morning, she had made a decision. She couldn't stay here alone, not with those men in the area. She would ride to town, alert the sheriff, and perhaps telegraph the nearest marshal about what she had seen. She packed quickly, taking only essentials and a few precious mementos: her wedding ring, which she threaded onto a leather cord around her neck, a small daguerreotype of Thomas, and a tiny knitted bootie that was to have been Sarah's. The cradle she left on the porch, unable to take it but unwilling to abandon it entirely. The ride to Pine Creek would take most of the day. Rose set out at dawn, her mare well rested and eager to move. The morning was clear and cool, the mountains to the west still tipped with snow despite the late summer season. She had traveled perhaps 2 hours when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Turning in the saddle, her heart sank as she recognized Burke and Dawson in pursuit. She urged her mare into a gallop, but the men were mounted on fresher horses and gaining rapidly. A shot rang out, deliberately wide, but close enough to make Rose's mare shy violently. She clung to the saddle, fighting to control the frightened animal. "Stop right there, Mrs. Blackwood." Burke shouted, "We just want to talk." Rose knew better than to believe him. She veered off the trail into denser trees, hoping to lose them in the forest. Another shot, closer this time, spurred her mare to greater speed. Branches whipped at Rose's face as they crashed through the underbrush. For a few precious minutes she thought she might escape. Then her mare stumbled in a small gully, sending Rose flying from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. By the time she scrambled to her feet, Burke and Dawson had caught up, dismounting to approach her on foot. "Now that wasn't very neighborly," Burke drawled, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "After we paid so well for your hospitality." Rose backed away, searching desperately for a weapon, an escape route, anything. "What do you want?" "Information," Dawson said, younger and apparently less hardened than his companion. About that bounty hunter you mentioned. I told you I didn't speak with him, Rose insisted, her back coming up against a tree. Burke laughed unpleasantly. That's funny because Weaver recognized your description. Seems that bounty hunter's been on our trail for days. His expression darkened. And I think you know exactly where he's headed. I don't, Rose said truthfully. He left days ago. I have no idea where he is now. Burke stepped closer, his intent clear in his eyes. I think you're lying, Mrs. Blackwood, and I don't appreciate liars. A shot cracked through the forest and Burke's hat flew from his head. He dropped to a crouch, drawing his pistol as Dawson scrambled for cover behind a fallen log. Next one goes between your eyes, Burke, called a familiar voice. Drop the gun and back away from the lady. Xavier stepped from behind a large pine, his rifle aimed steadily at Burke. Rose had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life. You're outnumbered, Holt, Burke called back, though he made no move to aim at Xavier. Weaver's circling around behind you as we speak. Weaver's tied to a tree half a mile back, Xavier replied calmly. Tried to ambush me when I was tracking you three. Didn't work out for him. Dawson's eyes widened, and he looked uncertainly at Burke, who was sweating now despite the cool air. I'll say it one more time, Xavier continued, taking a step forward. Drop the gun or I drop you. Burke hesitated, then slowly placed his pistol on the ground. Dawson, he hissed, shoot him. But Dawson, seeing the determination in Xavier's eyes, raised his hands instead. I ain't dying today, Burke. Not for you, not for Weaver, not for anybody. Xavier nodded approvingly. Smart choice, son. Now both of you on your knees, hands behind your heads. As the men complied, Xavier moved forward, keeping his rifle trained on them. You all right, Rose? He asked without taking his eyes off the outlaws. Yes, she managed, though her voice shook. How did you find me? Tracked these three back to your homestead yesterday, but you'd already left, followed your trail from there. He produced a length of rope from his coat pocket and tossed it to her. Would you mind? Rose secured Burke's hands behind his back, then Dawson's. Xavier checked the knots, then finally lowered his rifle. We need to collect Weaver and get these three to Pine Creek, he said. Sheriff, there has wanted posters on all of them. Rose nodded, still shaken but immensely relieved. My mare, she's fine, Xavier assured her. Spooked but not injured, she's grazing just over that rise. Within the hour, they had retrieved Rose's mare and collected Weaver, who glared sullenly at Xavier as they secured him to his horse. The ride to Pine Creek was tense but uneventful, the outlaws apparently having lost their bravado in the face of Xavier's steady competence. The sheriff was surprised but pleased when they rode into town late that afternoon. Xavier Holt, he greeted with a grin. Heard you were tracking these three, didn't expect you'd bring them in so soon. Had some help, Xavier replied, nodding toward Rose. Sheriff Mills tipped his hat to her. Madam, you assisted in capturing these men? Rose shook her head. Mr. Holt did all the capturing. I was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. After the men were secured in the town's small jail, the sheriff invited Xavier and Rose to join him for dinner at the hotel. Rose, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance after the day's ordeal, hesitated. I should find a room first, perhaps freshen up, she said. Of course, Sheriff Mills agreed. Hotel's got vacancies. We'll meet you in the dining room in an hour. Rose secured a small room and gratefully used the provided basin to wash away the dust and fear of the day. She changed into the one clean dress she had packed and did her best to arrange her hair neatly. When she entered the hotel dining room, she found Xavier and the sheriff already seated. Xavier stood as she approached, pulling out a chair for her. In clean clothes with his hat removed, he looked less like the hard-edged bounty hunter and more like an ordinary man, though still undeniably striking, with his broad shoulders and intelligent eyes. Mrs. Blackwood, he greeted her formally, though his eyes held a warmth that made her flush slightly. Mr. Holt, she returned, taking the offered seat. Sheriff Mills. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant, with the sheriff regaling them with stories of Pine Creek's colorful history. Rose found herself laughing for the first time since her losses, a sound that surprised her with its unfamiliarity. "So what brings you to town, Mrs. Blackwood?" the sheriff asked eventually. "Besides being chased by outlaws, that is," Rose sobered. "I was coming to alert you about those men. They visited my homestead yesterday, and I suspected they might be the ones Mr. Holt was tracking." "You were right," Xavier confirmed, "and it's a good thing you recognized the danger. They might have returned to your homestead with worse intentions." The thought sent a chill through Rose. "I'm not sure I can return there now," she admitted. "Even before this, I was considering leaving. There are too many memories." Sheriff Mills nodded sympathetically. "Heard about your troubles, madam. Very sorry for your losses." "Thank you," Rose said quietly. Xavier studied her face across the table. "Where would you go?" "My sister lives in Oregon. She's written several times asking me to join her." Rose twisted the napkin in her lap. "I just couldn't bear to leave while Thomas was so invested in the homestead. And then after he died, I couldn't bear to make any decision at all." "Oregon's a fair piece from here," the sheriff commented. "Dangerous journey for a woman alone." "There are regular stagecoaches now," Rose pointed out, "and I've already faced the worst dangers life has to offer." She glanced at Xavier, finding his expression unreadable. "What will you do now, Mr. Holt? With your quarry captured, collect the bounty," he said pragmatically, "then find the next job, I suppose." Something in his tone suggested weariness with this pattern, though Rose might have been imagining it. The conversation moved on to other topics, but she found herself watching Xavier more closely, noting the way his gaze frequently returned to her, the way his expression softened when he thought she wasn't looking. After dinner, Sheriff Mills excused himself, leaving Xavier and Rose alone in the hotel's small sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the simple furnishings. "I never properly thanked you," Rose said after a moment of comfortable silence, "for saving my life today." Xavier shook his head. "No thanks needed. I put you in danger by involving you in my business." "You did nothing of the sort," Rose countered. "You helped me when I was at my lowest. You showed kindness to a stranger." "As did you," he reminded her. "Offering shelter and food to a man you didn't know," Rose smiled slightly. "I suppose we're even then." Xavier leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Rose, about your homestead. I don't think I can return there," she said quickly. "Not to stay." "I understand that," he assured her. "But perhaps you shouldn't make that decision hastily. Land like yours is valuable. If you decide to leave, you should sell it properly, not abandon it." Rose hadn't considered this practical aspect. "You're right, of course, the thought of going back there alone." "You wouldn't have to be alone," Xavier said quietly. "I could accompany you, help you set things in order whether you decide to stay or go." Rose looked at him in surprise. "Don't you have other bounties to pursue?" "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "that perhaps it's time for a change. 12 years is a long time to chase other men's ghosts." He met her gaze directly. "Maybe it's time to stop running from my own." The implication hung in the air between them that they were both running in their different ways from the same pain of loss. "I would be grateful for your company," Rose said finally. "If you're certain," Xavier nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "I am." They returned to the homestead 2 days later, after Xavier had collected his bounty and Rose had sent a telegram to her sister in Oregon, explaining that her plans were uncertain. The ride was peaceful, the landscape beautiful in the late summer sunshine. As they crested the final rise and the homestead came into view, Rose felt a surge of conflicting emotions, grief, yes, but also a strange sense of homecoming. The cabin stood solid against the backdrop of distant mountains, the garden a patch of green in the golden prairie. And on the porch, just where she had left it, stood the empty cradle. Xavier followed her gaze and reined his horse to a halt beside hers. "We can remove it if you'd prefer." Rose considered this, then shook her head. "No, it's part of this place now, part of their memory." They rode the rest of the way in silence, dismounting in the yard. Rose approached the porch slowly, touching the cradle with gentle fingers. Xavier stood back, giving her space to reconnect with the home she had fled. "It feels different," she said after a while, "being here with someone else." "Different good or different bad?" Xavier asked cautiously. Rose turned to him with the ghost of a smile. "Different good, I think." They fell into a routine over the next few days. Xavier repaired the roof and reinforced the barn, while Rose preserved vegetables from the garden and put the house in order. They worked well together, moving around each other with an easy familiarity that belied their short acquaintance. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Rose told Xavier about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her journey west with Thomas, their dreams for the homestead. Xavier shared stories of his years on the trail, the places he'd seen, the people he'd met. Gradually, Rose found herself looking forward to these evening conversations, to the sound of Xavier's deep laugh, to the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She began to notice other things too: the breadth of his shoulders as he split wood, the gentleness of his hands when he tended to the horses, the quiet respect he showed for her space and her grief. A week turned into 2, and still Xavier stayed. He didn't mention leaving, and Rose didn't ask. The air grew cooler as September deepened, the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to turn gold. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Xavier cleared his throat. "I rode into town today while you were baking." Rose looked at him in surprise. She hadn't realized he'd left the homestead. "Oh, wanted to check if there were any messages." He hesitated. "There was a letter for you from Oregon and a telegram for me from the territorial marshal." Rose's heart sank. "The marshal wants you for another job." Xavier nodded slowly. "There's a gang causing trouble near Helena. He's asking if I'm available." "And are you?" Rose asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Xavier turned to look at her directly. "That depends." "On what?" "On you, Rose." His voice was soft but serious. "On whether there's a reason for me to stay." Rose's breath caught in her throat. "Xavier, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon, that you're still grieving. I needed you to know that I would stay if you wanted me to." Rose looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she still wore on the leather cord around her neck. "I do enjoy your company," she said carefully. "More than I expected to enjoy anyone's after Thomas." Xavier nodded, accepting this limited admission. "And the letter from your sister?" "I haven't read it yet," Rose admitted. "It's on the kitchen table." They fell silent, the weight of decisions yet to be made hanging between them. Finally, Rose stood. "I should read that letter." Xavier remained on the porch as she went inside. The letter was where she had left it, her sister's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Rose opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Rose, your telegram brought both relief and concern. I am so glad to hear from you after these difficult months, but worried about your uncertainty. You know there is always a place for you here with us. Robert has expanded the store, and the children would be overjoyed to have their aunt living nearby. However, I sense a hesitation in your words that wasn't there before. You mention a Mr. Holt who has been assisting you. Is there more to this arrangement than practical help? If so, I would not wish to pull you away from a chance at happiness, however unexpected its source. You have endured more than anyone should have to bear, my dear sister. If you have found someone who eases that burden, even a little, perhaps that is where you are meant to be. Whatever you decide, know that we love you and support you. Your devoted sister." Margaret Rose read the letter twice, her sister's perceptiveness both surprising and touching. Was there more to her relationship with Xavier than practical help? She hadn't allowed herself to consider the question directly, but now, forced to confront it, she couldn't deny the warmth that filled her whenever he was near, the sense of rightness she felt working alongside him. But was it disloyal to Thomas to feel this way? To consider building a new life with another man when her husband had been gone only a few months? She returned to the porch, letter in hand, to find Xavier still sitting where she'd left him, gazing out at the darkening landscape. My sister says I'm welcome in Oregon, she said, settling beside him again. But she also says she wouldn't want to pull me away from a chance at happiness, however unexpected its source. Xavier glanced at her, a question in his eyes. She means you, Rose clarified softly. Is that what I am? Xavier asked. An unexpected chance at happiness? Rose looked down at the letter, then back at Xavier's face, so different from Thomas's yet equally dear to her now in its own way. I think you could be, she whispered, if I let myself believe that's possible. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. I never expected to find you, Rose, never thought I'd feel this way again after Caroline. His voice was rough with emotion. But here we are, Rose echoed, turning her hand to clasp his. I'm not ready to leave this place, Xavier, not yet. There's still too much of Thomas and Sarah here for me to abandon it. Xavier nodded, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face before he mastered it. I understand. But, Rose continued, squeezing his hand, I find I'm not ready for you to leave either. Hope kindled in his eyes. What are you saying, Rose? I'm saying I'd like you to stay, to help me make this place what Thomas dreamed it could be. She took a deep breath. To see if what's growing between us might flourish, given time. Xavier's smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and hardship. I'd like that very much. The marshal's telegram, Rose reminded him, can wait, Xavier said firmly. Helena's problems will still be there if someone else doesn't solve them first. This, he gestured between them, this feels more important, Rose nodded, a weight lifting from her heart. It does. That night, for the first time, they moved the empty cradle from its place of prominence on the porch, setting it gently in the corner of the small room that would have been Sarah's nursery. Not forgotten, Rose said softly as they stepped back. Just not the center of everything anymore. Xavier put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, accepting his strength and offering her own in return. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened into winter. Xavier built an addition to the cabin, a new bedroom and an expanded kitchen, working through the first snowfall to finish the roof. Rose sewed curtains for the windows and braided a rug for the floor, creating a space that was neither purely hers nor Thomas's, but something new. They still slept separately, respecting the newness of their relationship and the ghosts that lingered. But their evenings were spent together by the fire, talking, reading, sometimes just enjoying the comfort of shared silence. As Christmas approached, Xavier rode into town for supplies and returned with not only flour and sugar for Rose's baking, but also a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Rose asked as he handed it to her. "Open it and see," Xavier suggested, his expression a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Rose unwrapped the paper to find a small wooden music box, intricately carved with flowers and birds. When she opened it, a sweet melody played a lullaby she recognized from her own childhood. "Xavier, it's beautiful," she breathed, tracing the carvings with her fingertips. "It reminded me of you," he said simply. "Strong but gentle, beautiful without trying to be." Rose blinked back tears, moved by both the gift and his words. "I don't have anything for you," she admitted. Xavier shook his head. "You've given me a home, Rose. After 12 years of wandering, that's the greatest gift I could imagine." Rose set the music box down carefully and stepped into his arms. It felt right, being held by him, her head tucked under his chin as if they had been designed to fit together this way. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Xavier Holt," she whispered against his chest, his arms tightened around her. "I know I've fallen in love with you, Rose Blackwood." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they drew apart, Rose saw in Xavier's eyes the same wonder she felt that after such loss, such pain, they had found each other. Winter passed in a cocoon of snow and firelight. They grew closer day by day, learning each other's habits and histories, building a foundation of trust and mutual respect. By spring, when the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow, they had become partners in every sense but one. On a mild April morning, Rose stood at the window, watching Xavier repair the garden fence in preparation for planting. His movements were sure and efficient, his shoulders broad under his work shirt. A wave of affection washed over her, accompanied by a certainty that had been growing for months. That evening after dinner, Rose took Xavier's hand and led him to the small room where the empty cradle still stood. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "This room was meant for a child." Xavier nodded, his expression cautious. "It was, perhaps." Rose took a deep breath. Perhaps it still could be. Someday, understanding dawned in Xavier's eyes. "Rose, are you saying I'm ready, Xavier, ready to be your wife if you'll have me? Ready to build a future that honors the past without being constrained by it." She touched the empty cradle gently. "Ready to fill this house with new life." Xavier took her face in his hands, his eyes bright with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier than to be your husband, Rose Blackwood." Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with promise and intention. When they parted, Rose smiled up at him, feeling truly at peace for the first time in nearly a year. "We should write to the circuit preacher," Xavier suggested. "He'll be through the valley in a few weeks." Rose nodded, then glanced at the cradle again. "And perhaps we should build a new cradle, not to replace this one but to stand beside it, a symbol of what was and what could be." Xavier understood immediately. "I'll start tomorrow," he promised. They were married on a perfect May morning, with Sheriff Mills and a few neighbors from nearby homesteads as witnesses. Rose wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Xavier, in a new shirt and clean trousers, looked at her as if she were the most precious sight he had ever beheld. The preacher spoke of new beginnings growing from sorrow, of love's capacity to heal and transform. Rose and Xavier exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to honor each other's past while building their future together. That night, as husband and wife, they finally shared the bedroom Xavier had built during the winter. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a joining of bodies that had already joined in spirit. Afterward, Rose lay in Xavier's arms, listening to his heartbeat beneath her ear, feeling complete in a way she had not believed possible again. "Thank you," Xavier murmured into her hair. "For what?" Rose asked, stroking his chest lightly, "For rocking that empty cradle." His voice was soft with emotion. "For letting me sit beside you when you were in pain, for showing me that life doesn't end with loss." Rose raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "Thank you for showing me the same," she whispered and kissed him deeply. Summer brought abundant crops and the completion of the new cradle, which Xavier had carved with painstaking care. It stood in the nursery beside the original, different in design but equal in craftsmanship and love. In July, Rose missed her monthly courses. By August, she was certain. She told Xavier on a warm evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance above the tall grass. "A baby," he repeated, wonder and joy transforming his face. "Our baby." Rose nodded, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Xavier knelt before her, pressing his forehead to her middle. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "You are already so loved." That night they stood together in the nursery, looking at the two cradles, one empty, one waiting. "Do you think Thomas and Sarah would approve?" Rose asked softly. Xavier considered this seriously. "I think they would want you to be happy, to continue living fully, as Caroline and James would want for me." Rose leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Then that's what we'll do. Live fully, love deeply, and keep their memory alive in this home we're building." Winter came again, and with it, Rose's expanding middle. Xavier was attentive to her every need, taking on additional chores as her pregnancy advanced, reading to her in the evenings as she knitted tiny garments for their coming child. On a snowy February night, their daughter was born with the assistance of a neighboring woman who had experience as a midwife. Xavier paced outside the bedroom until the first cry rang out, then rushed in to find Rose exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your daughter," Rose said softly. Xavier approached with reverence, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Rose placed the infant in his arms, and he stared down at the tiny face in awe. "She's perfect," he whispered, tears gathering in his eyes. "Absolutely perfect." They named her Hope Caroline Blackwood Holt, honoring both their pasts while celebrating their future. Xavier placed her in the new cradle that night, his large hand engulfing hers as he rocked her gently to sleep. Rose watched from the doorway, her heart full to bursting. The journey from that day when Xavier had found her rocking an empty cradle to this moment had been long and sometimes painful, but infinitely worthwhile. Spring came again, bringing with it Hope's first smiles and coos. One perfect morning, Rose sat on the porch with her daughter in her lap, while Xavier worked in the garden nearby. The homestead was flourishing under their care, new fruit trees planted, the barn expanded, fields of wheat rippling in the breeze. Xavier looked up from his work, catching Rose's eye with a smile that still made her heart skip. In that moment, surrounded by the life they had built together, Rose felt the final pieces of her heart heal and strengthen. The empty cradle still stood in the nursery, a reminder of what had been lost. But beside it rocked a cradle full of new life, new love, new hope, just as Xavier had once sat down to rock beside her in her darkest hour, showing her that grief need not be faced alone, and neither did joy.